also an alum from this institution. I got my master's and PhD a few decades ago here. And so it's a pleasure to go back after a few decades again. So Rick was brought from Washington State as an assistant professor, I think, in tenure track. And I needed a course, I started my PhD then, and I needed a course in waterfall management. So he was assigned 2 weeks to prepare that course, and I took it. So he remembered that I did that, and he was very embarrassed because he thought that was a very good course, right? That's me. I said, well, I got an A, so I don't have to worry about it. So, Rick.
Yes, sir.
You have further notice.
Yeah, in fact, I've been too ashamed I've been too embarrassed to ever ask Alonzo if he remembers what the quality of the teaching was.
That's what I'm here today.
It was 35 years ago. I was just hired at CSU, and they told me I had 2 weeks' notice because this faculty member had just had an issue and left. And I had 2 weeks' notice to prepare a course on waterfowl management. And Alonzo, I've never thrown away any of the course evaluations, but the stack is about this high, and so they would be the very first course. So they are there, but it's probably best. Some things in the past are best left. I was worried how I was going to be able to speak to you all because it's in the round, but now I know how you can speak. I can just stay here because there's nobody behind me. But I do want to thank. I want to thank Shannon Wagner, who's...
Jen.
Oh, Jen! I'm clearly nervous. I want to thank Jen Hitt from the communications person from the Warner College of Natural Resources. It's always good to get those things out, the early part of the talk. And Shannon Wagner, the executive assistant to Dean James Pritchard from the College of Agricultural Sciences, as well as James, the Dean, and an old friend of mine. And I want to thank Dean Alonzo Gary from the Warner College of Natural Resources, who's a former student. I guess I can say that safely at least. But yeah, thank you, and Jen, for whatever you're doing with that. But and actually, since we're going back down memory lane, so 35 years ago when I came to CSU, there were 2 university distinguished faculty that took me under their wings. And I have no idea why, probably because it was obvious I needed help. But one of them was Holmes Ralston from the philosophy department, and Holmes is still here. And the other was Bernie Rollins, also from the philosophy department. And Bernie's memory is enshrined in this Bernie Rollins well of knowledge. So it's, and maybe James, that's why I was always stopping you when I'd see you on campus. Can I please give a lecture there? I didn't know it was named after Bernie. But it's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, the title of my talk is Ranchers as a Keystone Species in a West That Works. And just to start off, we better define keystone species or give you at least one of several definitions, but they all try to capture the same thing. And it's a species whose importance is disproportionate to its numbers. So it has a far greater impact on the environment than just counting the sheer numbers or the total biomass of all the individuals. And that's basically the claim that I'm making in my presentation. And this hasn't come quickly. This is something that has been gleaned over decades of working with rural communities, particularly ranch families across the American West, from here to California, from Arizona, New Mexico, up to Montana, and Idaho, and Wyoming. And one day I just realized the West would be a very different place if we lost the ranch families. So the thing I want to do, so ranching or any land use, if it's sustainable, it has to work for the people whose livelihoods are attached to it, but it's also got to work for the land or it's exploited. If it's exploited, it usually has a relatively short shelf life. And I think the best way to look at this is look at the ecological aspects, certainly the economic livelihood aspects, and also the cultural aspects, so the human dimension part of this. In fact, a book I did with Ed Marston and Wendell Gilgert in 1990s, well, I'm not even sure when it came out, but it was titled Ranching West of the 100th Meridian, so in the region defined by the lack of sufficient moisture. And then the subtitle was The Ecology, the Culture, and the Economics. So I'm going to look at, and I'm touching down lightly. There is a well of peer-reviewed science information on the ecology, on the culture, and the economics. So I'm touching very superficially on that. So let's start with the economics. And here I'm going to compare ranches versus ranchettes. And ranchettes, I hope it's not a derogatory term, maybe sometimes it's said that way, but small acreage rural properties, okay? And some people ask why I have that comparison. As a generalization, private land in the American West is either going to be in agriculture or it's going to be in the hands of a developer. There are places where the threats of exurban development, of housing developments well beyond incorporated city limits, there are places still where this is not a threat. And people, so I've been on the board of the Colorado Cattlemen Agricultural Land Trust for the last 20 years, working with Colorado ranch families doing conservation easements. And people in eastern Colorado are never complaining about being overrun from people elsewhere. So there are places, but in so much of the American West, now the alternative to a family ranch, well, actually, ever since Yellowstone and COVID hit us with a double whammy, there's lots of new ranch owners that are very wealthy people. But historically, the combination has been developer on one end of the spectrum and a ranch family on the other end of the spectrum. So I'm comparing one economic aspect. Jen, this isn't going to work for you. She's trying to film this.
You're fine. You do your thing.
Stand still.
No,
I'm sorry.
you're doing great. No, it's.
I am not. Well, who are you filming? Oh, you're filming the slides. Good. Okay. I was getting worried. So, for the state of Colorado, for the state of Wyoming, you can go to the American Farmland Trust webpage, and they have a compendium of these cost of county services studies. And it's basically, what these studies do is they total the property taxes coming off of private rural lands. And then they total how much the county government and the school district. So think of sheriffs and school buses, but I mean so many other things the county government is providing and school districts are providing. So that's the cost. And they look at how much money is garnered from the property taxes, and they see, is this costing the county money, running a deficit, or is it actually maybe even generating a little bit of surplus for the county's budget? And I just pulled one. Actually, CSU's phenomenal Department of Ag Economics has done this for the entire state of Colorado. But this is one I pulled from the state of Wyoming. So for every dollar of property taxes coming off a small acreage development, and this is the average for the state of Wyoming, the data is collected by county, it costs the county $2.40 on average to pay for the county services that county residents expect. For every dollar of property taxes coming off a ranch, it costs in Wyoming on average, I think, 69 cents. So one is running a surplus, the other is deficit spending. And in fact, in my county, in our county, in Larimer County, our property taxes would have to go up 225% in order to meet the cost of county services. And the problem is, of course, you may have had a ranch that was 2,500 acres and one, maybe no more than 3 families living on it. That same ranch is now supporting 91 families on much, much smaller parcels. So that density, that human density is increasing. So there's just 91 more chances of spousal abuse or a rattlesnake there on the front porch, or some complaint that they're going to be calling county, or some cause for the school district. There's a lot more kids, so we need to replace the tires more, we need to hire more school bus drivers and stuff like that. So from an economic perspective, small acres developments, I haven't seen a single study yet, so these are studies that have been done in the southeast, the Midwest, the far west, the northeast. I haven't seen one yet where the property taxes on small acreage developments are actually covering the costs to the county of providing services. And this is something else that is, I guess it's the economic aspects of ranching. So the CSU's Department of Ag Econ did another study for the state of Colorado. And what they did, so Colorado has invests millions of dollars in private lands conservation. And what they're putting the money into are basically these working farms and ranches, and sometimes these family-owned forest lands for cutting timber products. So they're putting those things in conservation easements. The money's coming from Great Outdoors Colorado, which generates quite a bit of money, of course. It's coming from the Colorado State Income Tax Credit, which House Bill 1222, which passed in the legislature 2 years ago, is now giving a private landowner 90% of the developable value that, in other words, a developer would give you, up to $5 million, if you'll put your private land in a conservation easement and in perpetuity promise never to develop it. And in fact, you can't develop it because the IRS is watching. So anyhow, what the Ag Econ department did at CSU, they were able to, and we have 40 cities and counties in Colorado that have open space taxes, and 22 land trusts that are perfectly willing to work with private landowners, not to purchase their property, but to put a conservation easement on it and keep it in its productive working capacity. What Ag Econ did is accrue all the monies we've spent over the decades in paying for these conservation easements. And only an agricultural economist or an ecological economist could do this. They also, with remotely sensed data, such as soil types and elevation and water and stuff like that, they came up with the ecosystem services, so nature services that come off of undeveloped lands, particularly healthy undeveloped lands. They came up with a return on investment for every dollar the residents of Colorado are investing in conserving these private agricultural lands. They came up on the return on investment based on the value of these ecosystem services. If there were markets for them, and in most cases there are no economic payment for ecosystem services programs. And you can see what the return on investment is between $4 and $12, and the variance is in there because the estimates of the value of ecosystem services, I'm afraid I'm going too deep on this, has the variance estimates around it. It's not $4 for every cup of coffee. You know, it could be $12 for a cup of coffee or 25 cents if you go to the right place. And so these are nature services in the definition that are just for the benefit of us. Honest to God, we've actually done something where we finally acknowledged how self-centered, how self-centered we are, but nature services benefit all of us for our health, our happiness, and directly or indirectly, our economies. And so the residents of Colorado are getting billions of dollars of return from these investments. You only pay the landowner once to put their private land in a conservation easement. We get this return on ecosystem services to benefit us, all of us, year after year after year. And actually, the estimate is going to keep going up because they're not making any more land, and we're still developing a huge amount of of private land each year in Colorado, just shy of the size of Rocky Mountain National Park. So that's another bit of economic. I want to say one thing real quickly. All my life, my whole education, I've heard about sustainable economies. I mean, every course starting as a freshman, finishing my PhD, I always heard these lectures. You go and you hear the latest quantification on what's a sustainable economy. I didn't realize until 3 years ago that I'd been working with a sustainable economy for the previous 33 years. Sustainable economies. Does anybody think a sustainable economy is lucrative? No. The only time we make it lucrative, if you think of our own past history, is when it's exploited. If you want to shoot all the bison, pull all the minerals out of that vein of gold, trap all the beaver, cut all the big trees, that's not sustainable, because then you have to wait 300 years for big trees to grow to cut again. But if it's sustainable, it flirts every year on that thin economic margin of profit or loss. Ranching is lucrative usually one time in its history, and that's when the ranch is sold. And usually it ends up in the hands of a developer. It doesn't, of course, have to, but it often does. And that's when it's very lucrative, because suddenly you have all these homes sprouting where there have been cows. And I never understood that. And I'm not quite sure why I never had a teacher say, as an example of a sustainable economy, this is just one example, let's model it, and maybe we can learn and get closer to it in our own economies. But the people I've been working with, and I don't know if ranchers know they're sustainable, they know they're not lucrative. And they know they have had years in which they've lost money, and they know they've had years in which they cut a profit. But it was never lucrative until the last cash crop comes and they sell out to a developer. Okay, ecological aspects. So I want to show you, this is from a graduate student of mine. We had he did this for a number of ranches north of Fort Collins, but still in Larimer County, that had been sold to developers and reappeared in housing in small acreage development. So this is, it's 2,500 acre ranch. There's 91 homes on it now. The little black dots are perforating, those are the house sites. And maybe the way your eyes look some Monday mornings, the bottom panel, those are year-round access roads to those 91 homes. And so again, I'm sort of comparing the ecology of a ranch and an ex-urban development, small acreage developments, way beyond incorporated city limits. And what this graduate student did, so he found multiple intact cattle ranches still in northern Larimer County, and multiple former ranches that are now in housing developments. And we were fortunate enough to find protected areas that hadn't been fragmented, but didn't have cows. So we had unfragmented landscapes with cows. We had unfragmented landscapes in a protected area status without cows. And then former ranches that are now homes, dogs, cats, and all the things that we take with us wherever we go to live. So, and replicates of it too. Critically, it was the same soil type, same plant community, and approximately the same elevation. That's hard to do, to keep all those things constant. And he looked at the plant communities, the songbird communities, and the carnivore communities on these three different land uses. And actually, when you think about it, protected areas, cattle ranches, and ex-urban housing developments are probably three of the principal land uses of rural landscapes to the arid west. I'm not saying there are not a few more out there, but these are probably the three principal ones we have. And what he found, and this just shows you some of the data, the papers published in Conservation Biology, but what he found is that the cattle ranches, so those unfragmented, large acreage landscapes that still had livestock on, had the preferable, the species that conservation biologists like me covet and want to see the perpetuation of. And sadly, the ex-urban developments, and this is a generalization, so don't take it to the bank and expect to get a deposit, but they basically had what we have in the Fort Collins suburb. They had generalist species, so you had garter snakes instead of yellow-bellied racehorse, and you had skunks and raccoons instead of badgers, and you had vesper sparrows and green-tailed towies and all these other species that we care about. And I'm not saying they didn't have robins, and they do have some garter snakes, and they have skunks and raccoons too. But they had all these other species of conservation interest. The ranch was the best, particularly when it came to the plant communities. So the protected areas without cows, the percent plant cover of non-native, so invasive plants, was considerably higher than the cattle ranches. And one species in particular, cheatgrass, was pervasive on these protected areas without cows, compared to the cattle ranches, which also had cheatgrass, of course, because you cannot. Cheat Takes Over the West is the name of one of Leopold's chapters in the Santa County Almanac. And that was an observation based on the 30s. If you came back now, he'd shut it. So does anybody know what is missing between these protected areas without cows and these equivalent sized areas with very low human densities, but with cows? What do you think made the difference? Cows made the difference. Ranchers, and I'm not saying protected area managers don't also know their grasses, forbs, shrubs, and trees, but ranchers certainly know because they affect the bottom line. I'm not saying cheatgrass can't be grazed. It can. It has a real short duration where it's palatable. It starts germinating in November, but we don't want to get into that. That's probably the reason it's so hard to completely do away with. But the ranchers could use cows, and they can put their cows, they can move their cows around and put them on the cheatgrass when it's green, and those cows can eat it, and there's going to be fewer seeds formed, and you're not going to see that expansion of cheatgrass on into the native cool and warm season grass communities. All right, there's some people here that are old enough, maybe not. We used to have this world-famous plant ecologist, Tom Stolgrim. Did you know him, James? In the NREO. Tom was an amazing guy. He was probably he was defined both by the quality of his research, but also by his quirks. For example, before Tom fully retired, he wrote novels about the old American West, and in every one of them, the Indians won. So he went against the total mythology of Hollywood and American Western literature. So of course, we all cheer him on. It's about time. Well, anyhow, Tom published this paper in Ecological Applications. And what he did, I mean, this study was just waiting. Talk about low-hanging fruit for a scientist. He went to 5 western states on national forests. And what the national forest does, it has these grazing exclosures. So 4 to 5 strands of barbed wire fence in areas where they're grazing permits. So cows are grazing everything, but they can't get into the exclosures. Oh, another sign of quirkiness. Do we have any plant ecologists here, people that measure plants, sample plants? He did 1,000 square meter plots. Nobody does 1,000. So you're counting the stems and you're counting the surface area of the plant, and he did 1,000 square meter plots. Nobody does it. But we all should, because it's going to be much closer to an approximation of what's actually going on. Anyhow, he published his paper in Ecological Applications, and you can read, he didn't find any difference between the grazed and the ungrazed areas. This is still the single best study ever done on the effects of grazing. And in fact, we were working with a writer for the New York Times. She was doing a half-page spread. And she was talking to me, and I said, you need to talk to Tom, because his study is incredible. So she called up Tom, and afterwards she called me back. And, yeah, this is great, but boy, he sure didn't want to talk to me. It's because Tom was no fan of livestock or of ranchers. But Tom was somebody who could separate his personal values from the evidence, the empirical evidence. And so he published it. Whether he endorsed it or not, and that's why he didn't want to talk to the New York Times writer. Anyhow. So then a group of us did a meta-analysis. And that's simply on a particular topic, you get all the peer-reviewed science papers, and with their findings, through the meta-analysis, you try to emerge with some generalizations. And this was published in Ecological Applications. I don't know if that's easy enough for you to read in black, but this is straight out of the paper. The consensus opinion among ecologists is that ex-urban development alters ecological processes and native biodiversity to a greater extent than forestry and ranching. So again, sometimes we find ourselves, well, increasingly in this country, we find ourselves between what we want to believe and what the actual evidence is. We're living in the swirl of all that every single day today in the United States. Well, it's also true in science. There's a lot of values. We all have values, and I think they trump empirical evidence most of the time. And maybe we just don't want to hear the evidence. We want to cling to our values. And so I was one of the co-authors, but I took the liberty of throwing this in here. At one end of the spectrum lies a land developer, at the other end, a land steward. I would say the ranchers I tend to work with are the progressive ranchers who may not have a tattoo on their body saying this, but acknowledge the reality things change. And the West is continually changing. It never really was static. Okay. So cultures matter. Wendell Berry, this is not from anything that Wendell Berry wrote, but I personally believe writing in the English language, there is nobody alive today who writes more succinctly and evocatively, because he's also a poet as well as a novelist and an essayist on agriculture. He came to a Quivira coalition, his only stipulation, I'm not giving the talk, but I'll take questions from the audience. And my wife Heather and I were sitting there as fervently as we could. We were writing things down. Everything he said was like this strain of wisdom coming out of his mouth. It was amazing. And he said this, and the reason I reflect on this is we live in a society that operates at the speed of cyberspace. The information we use every day when we Google or however you access it is generated literally at the speed of sound. It's fast knowledge. And of course, a lot of it is made up too, but it's fast. It's nice to know that we're starting to slow down and pay attention to indigenous people who have been here thousands of years and are truly the holders of what I would call slow knowledge. Stuff that has been gleaned off of living on a piece of land, that soil type, that climate, that plant community, that animal community, for generation after generation after generation. And the things that were adaptive, that allowed them to perpetuate that civilization, were passed on. That's slow knowledge. You can't just Google it and find the answer that you'd like. Wallace Stegner, the now late Wallace Stegner, but the great American writer on the West, in an essay titled Wolf Willow, wrote that ranchers, he was talking about ranchers on the eastern plains of Montana, and he called them a near-indigenous culture. Now, they haven't been ranching here anywhere near as long as the first people have been here. But they have been ranching in parts of the United States now for over 400 years. Juan de Onate, a Basque Spaniard, came out, took an entrada out of Mexico City and followed the Rio, came through El Paso del Norte and followed saying, heads up, let's just don't. In fact, I like to think if we, when us Caucasians first came and settled the American West, if we'd have slowed down and listened to the first people, we would have learned how to settle the West better. Because we certainly weren't prepared to live in an arid land. Most of us came from the Atlantic coast where it's wet, and they get like 36 inches of moisture. We're lucky if we get 7 to 9 inches this year, the way things are going. And it's all being sublimated by the blankety blank blank wind. Yeah. And then, like I said, just because I was a conservation biologist, and private lands are the least protected of our lands, much less protected than our public lands. I started working with ranch families decades ago because I wanted to see, because they were holding, because of their soils being richer, the elevation being lower, et cetera, they were the most biologically productive lands. And if you're a conservation biologist, those are the people to work with, particularly if they're willing to work to conserve their private lands as opposed to hold on to it for when the developer offers the right price. And so I've actually been on a number of these boards, 7 of these boards, but what I've noticed over the decades is progressive ranchers are really playing an unheralded leadership role in a West that works better. They don't get any credit for this. But every one of these groups actually had ranch families that initiated it, so they're very bottom up. They're not top down. And they're making a difference. In fact, because I was able to pick the boards I served on, just 7 of these, I went through a long weekend and just tried to list all the things that they have done in the years that I worked with them. And they've done all kinds of things, but I think maybe, particularly in today's crazy times of hyper-polarization, is helping break the cycle of conflict and litigation and hate by fostering collaboration. Appointment books and calendars and pretty pictures of public lands across the American West, particularly Colorado, every single year. The guy is a marketing genius. Well, one day he came back from one of those extended field trips taking pretty pictures on public lands, and he came up to the Nature Conservancy and the Colorado Cattlemen Agricultural Land Trust, the largest land trust in the state. And he said, you know, I can't get these darn pictures anymore because the foreground, the low elevation private lands, the background is beautiful, right? They're protected because they're public lands. But I got this housing development. Now, it's true, I can cut all that out, but I'm going to leave out those plains. Developers are definitely within what they are entitled to do, and the landowners are definitely entitled to sell their private land. This is America. So, but if you're an ecologist or a conservation biologist, you need to pay attention. Because these are the lands that are supporting our natural heritage, and they're the ones generating those ecosystem services. So I would say it'd even be important for state and county elected officials to maybe take a crash course on what an ecosystem service is. One more thing. So this is Warner and Wendy Glenn. Heather and I are leaving Monday to go work for them for 2 weeks. So Warner and Wendy have 3 ranches on the Sonora-Arizona border in Cochise County. And they were co-founders of the Malpai Borderlands Group. And that's one of the preeminent rancher-led collaborative conservation groups. They've had a lot of support from a lot of groups, a lot of people out of Tucson and Phoenix, because what they're trying to do is somewhat put a damper on this rural sprawl, this ex-urban sprawl. Buy ranches, break it in Arizona into 10-acre parcels or 20-acre parcels. Colorado, it has to be 35 unless you go through the planning department. So I just threw them in there for one other thing. So I think a lot of us appreciate we live in a region where you can either have a first-rate mind or be a little schizophrenic. Because we live in a region that's about half public and half private. And it's not all neatly divided with all the private land east of Interstate 15 on the Wasatch Front and all the public land sequestered off west of Interstate 15. No, it's a collage. I hope, do I have it? I don't have a slide. God, I wish I could show you a slide of virtually any county in the American West. Private and public lands. Just cheek to jowl. It's unbelievable. It's like taking a crossword puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle, throwing it out there, and that's the way it looks. So that's why I said you have to have a first-rate mind to handle this seeming contradiction, or just... So anyway, I'm going to show you another study from another grad student that suggested there's this incredible... Well, we have a public-private partnership already, but we don't tend it well. It's like a gardener who plants the seeds, but then doesn't water them and doesn't weed them. And so you have a really weedy garden patch. And some things that you can eat grow, and most of the things...
Red blue is private.
Pardon?
Color blue is private. The colors.
That's the percent of the state that is private. Alonzo. So it's the percent in Colorado, and I don't know what it's shown. Is that the percent that's private or public? Now I'm confused. You asked the one question, which is good because it means you're paying attention.
Rick, just look at Texas. It's private.
It's private. I knew that. I'm still trying to recover from calling Sharon? Is that it? Okay. So what this amazing grad student, Colin Tallard of mine, did for the Southern Rocky ecoregion. So he just picked one of the ecoregions that define the United States. And that's basically southern Wyoming, northern New Mexico, and what's between them, Colorado. And he found all the polygons of all, my audience left, he found all the polygons of all the private land in the Southern Rocky ecoregion. And then he found out which of them were ranchers and which had Forest Service or Bureau of Land Management grazing leases. So he was able to find about 21.5 million acres of private land, and about 21% of those are ranch lands with public grazing leases on the adjacent forest or on the adjacent BLM. And he found a number of interesting things. One of them, within 1 kilometer of the boundary of all the public lands in the Southern Rocky ecoregion, 43% of the boundaries of that bit of Forest Service land or that bit of BLM land, within 1 kilometer, 43% of their boundaries were ranchers that had a public land grazing lease. So we've got this public-private partnership going on right now. And it's really important because, so do you see, yeah, you've seen this before. So that's that 2,500 acre ranch that now has 91 homes on it. Do you know what's immediately to the north of that ranch, that now development's private boundary? It's the Canyon Lake District of the Roosevelt National Forest. And so step out of the classroom and look to the west, and then shift north of Longs Peak and get out of Rocky Mountain National Park. That's the Roosevelt National Forest. Can you imagine what it's like if you're a Forest Service employee and historically you had to deal with 3 families on 2,500 acres? Today you have to deal with 91 families on 2,500 acres. Can you imagine what happens if a fire starts on that National Forest Service lands? Those ranchers are going to go ape. They're going to implode because there's 91 homes there and we sure can't let them torch. Can you imagine to a mountain lion, can't wait till we see it, but as fall turns to winter and the temperatures change and the mule deer start this elevational drop off the higher elevation public lands onto the lower elevation private lands, and the lions, of course, are following because they're not tied anymore to their offspring. Their offspring follow them. They're fully mobile. And all of a sudden, instead of hitting the McMurray Ranch, you hit 91 small acreage ranchettes, and every 14-year-old's got his dad's Uzi. And then you've got those year-round metallic carnivores driving 24/7 and accidentally running over rattlesnakes and badgers and skunks and raccoons and lions and black bears and lark bunnies and everything else. There's nothing good about it. There's nothing good about it. So these private lands can buffet, like in this example, or buffer our public lands. And we've already got this partnership, we just need to nurture it. Those ranchers, 21% of 19.5 million acres, or whatever it was now, those ranchers have a public lands grazing permit. So they're dependent upon a good relationship with the federal government, because that's where their cows are in the summer. I think we've been taking this for granted maybe a little bit too long. And we care about a whole variety of those ecological and economic aspects. I'm almost done. So this is a quote. This is a book that came out by George Ortner, a friend of mine. George, Welfare Ranching, the Subsidized Destruction of the American West. And out of that book comes this quote: yes, we're destroying a way of life that goes back 100 years, 400 if you're in northern New Mexico. But it's a way of life that is one of the most destructive in our country. Ranching is one of the most nihilistic lifestyles the planet has ever seen. It should end. Good riddance. Or Wendell Berry again, and I find a lot of truth in this. The most tragic conflict, and he says the most, in the history of conservation is that between environmentalists and farmers and ranchers. It's tragic because it's unnecessary. There's no irresolvable conflict here. But the conflict that exists can be resolved only on the basis of a common understanding of good practice. So, husbandry, of animal stewardship, of land. Okay, we need to study and foster working models. Farms and ranches that are striving to bring economic practice, which is always the bottom line, into line with ecological reality. With local food economies in which consumers, all of us conscientiously support the best land stewardship. And so this is, and you could rephrase these the key elements of that couple of sentences a number of ways, but you still come up with the bottom. But I do believe it's unnecessary. I think our values, it's not only the bad people that have bad values. The good people have inappropriate values too. You and I, every one of us, have values not substantiated by empirical evidence, but they're buttressed by beliefs. And they get in the way sometimes. So, Keystone species, which is what the title was, or anachronism. That's entirely up to you to decide. It's like I tell my students, when I have a lecture on conservation ethics, I tell them, I had a student once ask, which ethic should I believe in, Dr. Nunn? I said, thank you for asking that. That's up to you. But at least do them all justice by spending time trying to get to know those ethics. There's none of them that are wrong. So this is Jim Corbett. He was also one of the pivotal, you've heard of Jim Corbett? The late Jim Corbett? My God. Pardon?
Is that book?
Yeah. So Jim was one of the co-founders of the Malpai Borderlands, and long before anybody else was trying to get people coming out of Mexico safely into the United States, because the death rate, particularly during long times against World War. And anyhow, Jim was very much involved in what was going on in the Southwest. And in most of the Arid West, ranching is one of only a few livelihoods based on human adaptation to wild biotic communities. And I guess, since I gave the talk, I had the last word. I concur with that. So thank you very much. 1 second. I promised the Human Dimensions of Natural Resources Department, if you haven't got enough, go to Behavioral Sciences. What's the time? From 5 to 6, there's pizza and hot cocoa, and you can watch these wild videos that our students have created. They're all short, so they're not lengthy things. And I can't believe, I don't know where the money's coming from for the pizza and the cocoa, but anyhow, that's today at 5 o'clock. So thank you very much.